Welcome back, everyone, to part 7 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Today we're taking a closer look at the economy. Exciting topic. We're going to look at farmland, ownership and care, both in the north and the south, the use of silver diachronically, and then finally some differing concepts, or differing ideas on charging interest. So, the ownership and care of farmland can be distinguished in Mesopotamia, go figure, between the north and the south. So again, in the south, there was irrigation farming. They're below the 200 millimeter ISO height. So, rainfall agriculture is not possible in the south. And as we have seen in previous weeks, much of the land, therefore, was owned by the great organizations, the palace and the temple. In addition, to a lesser degree, private absentee owners rented their fields to tenant farmers and collected from them. In the north, however, where there was rainfall agriculture, there were village communities and a type of feudal system. There was a very thin layer at the top with the king, his family, and his high officials. And this type of structure made it possible when an invading force would take command, take over the regime. It would allow this feudal system to stay in place by simply exchanging one regime for another. By the neobabylonian period, which is essentially the middle of the first millennium BCE, the amount and the size of land that was rented out had increased dramatically. And this happened contemporaneously with a decrease in the use of serfs and slaves and other workers by the great organizations, the palace and the temple. And so there was this movement away from the centralized care to more privatization. Now, the use of silver is an important part of the economy in Mesopotamia to understand. As a means of payment, silver was weighed at each transfer. However, early on, particularly in the Babylonian period, silver was the standard by which things were measured in value, but things were not generally, Oppenheimer argues, paid for or purchased with silver at the actual transaction. However, by the Neo-Babylonian period, extensive vocabulary existed that described the type and the purity of the type of silver, a type and purity of the silver that would be used in an exchange. There was a development of the use of silver over time. Of course, as we would expect, most of the silver was found in the palace or the temple. As a final point, we're going to look at charging interest. So there was an interesting idea, or there was a differing point of view of the concept of charging interest to one's countrymen in the West and in the East. So in the West, we have a text from Ugart that says, "Give, in the meantime, the 140 shekels, which are still outstanding from your own money, but do not charge interest between us. We're both gentlemen." Ugart is in the West. Similarly, in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 23:20, "You may charge interest to a foreigner," the law says, "but to your own countrymen you shall not charge interest." The idea of charging interest usually was a taboo. However, in the East, you don't see this. In Mesopotamia, you don't see this. For example, in the old Assyrian trade colonies, charging interest was standard practice. So the old Assyrian traders had no such rules. So there seems to be a distinction between the ideas of charging interest in the East of the ancient Near East and in the West. And Oppenheim has a theory, you can read about it if you like, as to why this might be. But it's just interesting to note why you see this, for example, in the West and less so in the east. So, to recap, the southern farmlands were owned and managed primarily by the temple and the palace. The northern farmlands were feudal in nature, with the king, his family, and his high officials at the top. Silver was the standard throughout Mesopotamian history, but only later was it used in common transactions. And finally, the charging of interest was considered, quote-unquote, taboo, was considered taboo in the West, but not so in the East. Next week, we're going to take a closer look at the palace and temple organizations that we continue to refer to. Try to go into a bit more detail concerning them so that you can have a better understanding of the central role that they played throughout Mesopotamian history. But until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?